an update about the situation in Syria, where government forces have been battling foreign-backed insurgents for more than 3 years.
In 2011, following the so-called Arab Spring that swept over the Middle East and North Africa, demonstrations were also held in Syria in favour of political reform. But these demonstrations soon turned into armed conflict, especially when regional powers got involved. Syria's borders with Turkey were laid open to militants who used it to enter into Syria and fight the Syrian government. Countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar supported the militants, and bases for training the militants were set up in Turkey and Jordan with the coordination of the United States. All these activities turned Syria into the war-stricken country it's become today. Taking a look at the borders of Syria now in 2014, we'll start with Turkey. You can see there that the border with Turkey is under the control of ISIL terrorists, as well as other militant groups, including the Al-Nusra Front and the FSA, or the Free Syrian Army, as well as Kurdish fighters. On the borders with the occupied Palestine, we see the presence of militant groups as well. And these militant groups are reportedly getting the support of Israel, some of them being treated in Israeli hospitals. And now, remaining the border with Lebanon, we can see the strong presence of government troops there, since that border is being strengthened from the Lebanese side. But what's evident from this map, of course, is the large swathes of land that are now under the control of ISIL militants. But what's interesting is that not all of these areas are inhabited or populated areas. In this map, we can see the white areas, which are the unpopulated areas. And from this, we can conclude that government forces are in control of most of the populated areas, and they're continuing their battles to force militants out of Aleppo in the north that are in the south and the suburbs of the capital, Damascus.
Powerful super typhoon is on a collision course tonight.
Right now, where there are, among the many threats we face, which go on all the time, there are two which literally threaten species survival. That's serious, and they're both being escalated. One is the threat of nuclear war, which is quite serious. Look, we're in a position right now where there are, among the many threats we face, which go on all the time, there are two. They are carrying out the actions which are defunding possible efforts to do something about these crimes. Furthermore, they're backed by major concentrations of power. The major business lobbies, for example, have announced that they're funding big propaganda campaigns to convince people that this doesn't matter. These are serious issues. Incidentally, if we want to look at stupid people, we find them all over the place. For example, we happen to be right in the middle of a huge financial crisis, people have noticed. And you trace that back. A lot of it comes from a fanatic religious belief in what's called the efficient market hypothesis. This pure fanaticism dominated the economics profession, dominated the Federal Reserve. The one consequence was that when an $8 trillion housing bubble developed, totally unrelated to any fundamentals, completely off the 100-year history of housing prices, the profession and members of the Fed, the central bank, said it's not necessary to pay attention because of efficient markets. I mean, is that very different from God promised Noah? That's great.
Michael Shermer, Skeptic Society. My last question is a little bit personal. It's up to you to answer or not. If there is God, which I argue there is God, in fact I had debate with president of atheist organization in New Jersey and also with Michael Shermer, Skeptic Society. But if there's God, if you had a chance to ask a question and get an answer, and a prayer get an answer, what would be your question to know and your prayer?
May not be the most polite comment, but my basic feeling is like Thomas Paine. If there is a God, he's a devil.
Oh no.
And if you look in the entire literary canon, I mean, God is such a genocidal fanatic that he was willing to destroy every living thing on earth because some human being offended him. I mean, you can't, that's the Noah story.
No, we have to have rain check for this debate. I really, I think I disagree with that. I think I have very good discussion for that, but hopefully, I don't know whether you are interested to discuss this issue, problem of evil. And what was your prayer?
My prayer?
Yeah, something that wanted too many things.
Too many things.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm interested in improving things. This human species now is on a precipice facing disaster for two cases. The one is environmental catastrophe, which is coming, and the other is nuclear war, which gets worse and worse every year. And I'm not interested in abstract considerations. I'd like to be able to deal with those. Otherwise, there's nothing else to talk about.
That's right. Thank you.
The following program is a UW-TV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection with Al Page. Our guest is Professor Noam Chomsky from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a guest lecturer at the University of Washington.
What determines how language in a particular country evolves? Why is French, for example, so different from German?
Well, first of all, you're assuming the French is different from German, and
The French would probably say so.
you know, there's no simple measure of how different languages are from one another. In fact, if you look at the languages structurally, the way a linguist would look at them, French is different from the other Romance languages in a variety of ways, which make it more similar to German and other Germanic languages. There are a number of features of French which are sort of Germanic in character.
Give us some of those features.
Well, for just to take a simple one, in all the Romance languages, except for French, you can delete the subject of a sentence. You can say the equivalent of walks to the store, meaning he walks to the store. We can't do that in English, but you can do it in Italian or Spanish, and in fact, it's common Romance, goes right back to Latin. French is the only Romance language in which you can't do that. It's like a Germanic language, pretty much, in that respect. They have what they call clitics, small pronouns that you attach to verbs. So you say the equivalent of I, him, saw. That's common Romance. But in the other Romance languages, you can do things like I, him, want to see. You can do that in all, meaning I want to see him, but not in French. And for a variety of constructions, actually, there are quite a number of respects in which French is different from the other Romance languages. Incidentally, Old French, Middle French, say French in the medieval period was not. It was like the other Romance languages. So something happened to it that made it less like the Romance languages and more like the Germanic languages.
How does language change over time?
People in nearby villages in France who virtually could not understand one another. The idea of a national language is a pretty modern phenomenon. It has to do with the rise of nationalism, and you have to learn the national language when you go to school. It's a different language than the one you spoke at home. When we talk about language changing, what's actually happening is that it's kind of like species changing. There's a mixture of all sorts of dialects, and the mix changes over time, either because of conquest or some political change, or boundaries are drawn in a different place, or some kind of commercial interchange or whatever. The mixture of these things changes over time, and you take a look at it a few centuries apart, it looks like there's a different language. But what happens is that between generations, there are usually small changes having to do with other influences from the outside and so on. And these things are cumulative. Sometimes they lead to pretty dramatic changes. I mean, within a couple of generations, a language can change structurally in quite dramatic ways. And of course, in, say, lexicon, the words of the language, well, that's a different matter altogether. So when technology develops, you get a whole new vocabulary.
But if you were in France in the 12th century and you understood all the nuances of language, could you have predicted how these various languages would have evolved over time?
No, it's totally impossible. I mean,
is it partially random?
It's not so much that it's random. It's not actually random. For all we know, it might be completely deterministic. There's just too many factors involved. It's like predicting the weather. There's just too many things going on. Human life is a pretty complicated affair, and now our cultures speakers of English can be misled by this. English is relatively homogeneous. You can go a long way in the United States. I just came from Boston, and I understand everybody in Portland and Seattle and so on. But that's not true of most of the world. Most of the world, language areas, you can get very different languages pretty close by. And much of the world is what we would call multilingual.
The closer I get to the border between France and Germany, the closer the languages become.
Yeah, well, in particular, if you go from, say, Paris to Rome, as you go toward the Italian border, it starts to sound more like Italian, and at some point it becomes Italian. And there isn't, in fact, by now there's enough national unity and so on, so you can really find the border. But if you go back a little ways, there was no border. It was just, I wouldn't say a continuum, it was just constant changes and fluctuations and variations. And you started speaking one thing in one place and another thing in another place, and they're not mutually intelligible often. But along the way, there are just all sorts of changes. Now, with the rise of national states, and especially national communications and national education systems and all of these things, which is a pretty modern phenomenon, then you get what we call national languages. Now, as I say, English is unusual. The reason, after all, You go to pre-colonial times, there were just hundreds of thousands, probably, of different languages spoken in what's now called the United States. Well, through the destruction of the indigenous population, and it was real destruction, kind of genocidal, and the conquest by speakers of basically one group, you ended up having a large homogeneous language. But how could anybody have predicted that? I mean, it had to do with the invention of guns and, whole political conquest and all sorts of things. And that's pretty much what human history is.
There are some French theorists, for example, who argue that they must work very hard to keep the French language pure. What does that mean?
It doesn't mean anything. I mean, there's an old, virtually every national language, every national culture, or at least the European ones, maybe others, has a mythology that that's the only real pure language, and all the others are corrupt. In France, this position is kind of extreme. In fact, if you go back to its origins, it's even a little bit comical. I don't know if anybody's actually studied it, but if you go back to, say, the 18th century and you read, say, Diderot, he explains, Diderot, very seriously, that he says, here's a prediction for you. He says, France is going to be the language of science, and German and English will be the languages of literature. And the reason for this is that French is very clear. In France, the words follow the order of the thoughts, whereas if you listen to German and English, the words don't quite follow the words of the thought. So French is good for telling the truth because of its, what later came to be called its Gallic lucidity and clarity, whereas German and I think his examples were German and English, maybe Italian. They're good languages for telling fantasies and falsehoods, so they'll be the languages of literature. Now, it's a sort of naive point of view, but you can see what was going on in his head. I mean, for him, the words in French follow the order of thoughts. When you hear German, it seems all confused. I mean, they're thinking in some other way. The speaker of German looks the opposite, of course. And I suspect that the mythology of the purity and lucidity and clarity of French goes back to ideas of that kind. After all, French culture had a certain dominance and appeal for a long time, so these attitudes get established. But what does it mean for the language to be pure? Or when people say they want English to be pure, what are they talking about? Was Shakespeare pure? I mean, in fact, every stage of history, languages are... First of all, there is no such thing as a language. There are just lots of different ways of speaking that different people have, which are more or less similar to one another. And some of them may have prestige associated with them. For example, some of them may be the speech of a conquering group, or a wealthy group, or a priestly caste, or one thing or another. And we may decide, okay, those are the good ones, and some other ones the bad one. But if social and political relations reversed, we'd make the opposite conclusions. Let's say take Black English today. Black English is considered not quite proper English. On the other hand, if blacks happen to have all the power and own all the corporations and whites were working for them, it would be the other way around. Okay, Black English would be the language of culture and science and so on, and the stuff that you and I speak would be considered a degenerate dialect, which you have to get people out of so that they'll be able to think.
But that raises an interesting question. Why does language have rules? Why were we taught these rules? But I can see every grade school teacher about to throw an orange at you on the screen.
Unfortunately, let me be a little more nuanced. One of the things you learn in grade school is the literary language. Now, in English, the literary standard is not so radically different from what, say, you and I grew up with, but it's somewhat different. The literary standard is not what I learned in the streets. It's not very different, but it's a little different. And when I went to school, I was taught the literary standard. Now, the literary standard has some principles associated with it, some of which are those of a real language, some of which are completely artificial. They were made up by people who had crazy ideas about language.
And they were all given names you never heard of before.
Yeah, and in fact, the reason you have to teach them is because they are not the person's language. Your actual language, nobody teaches you. I mean, your language just grows in your head. You stick a young child in an environment where people are speaking language, and that child can no more help knowing that language than the child can help growing. It's just part of human growth is for some component of the brain to pick up the language. You can't learn it, and you don't learn it any more than you learn to see. Now, the fact is that the the system that grows in the brain is sometimes different from a system which is regarded, for whatever reason, as necessary or appropriate or approved or something, some prestige dialect. And it may be different from what grew in your brain. It typically is.
Or it may be a way of trying to get us to have a common bond through language.
Well, it's possible. I mean, I think that's a problem in places like, say, Italy. In Italy, when you, if somebody grows up in the Piedmont area and somebody else grows up in the Naples area, they speak totally different languages. Neither can understand a word the other's saying. So there, when you teach what they call Italian, which is the language roughly of the area of Florence, of Tuscany, you're teaching people what amounts to a second language, and it's the national language. Same is true in Germany and
China.
Well, China is even worse, because what we call Chinese is a set of languages which are as different from one another as the different Romance languages. They just happen to be all yellow on the map or something, and they happen to be a unified political area, but there's no sense in which they're the same language. We call them Chinese dialects, but that would be like calling French and Romanian two different dialects of the same language, Latin or something. I mean, all of these terms have no linguistic meaning. They have only socio-political meaning of a very complex sort. And the way in which they interact with authority structures is crucial. So what we call good English is a system which is partly artificial, I should say, which is taught to people because it was legislated to be good English. Now, some of what is taught, it breaks, I forget what it word, I shall, you will, or some strange thing. That violates, there are certain principles of human biology which determine what a language can be, and no language can be like that. So that had to be, or you have to teach people how to say he and I instead of him and me. Well, English sort of works the other way. I mean, if nobody was bothering you in English, you'd probably say him and me or here or something like that. But you're taught in the standard language not to do that. There's some other invented language, which is called the literary standard, in which you don't do it. And you ask the question, why do you have to teach people? Well, you have to teach them because it's artificial. It's not their language. And often it's not just not their language. Sometimes it's not even any possible language.
Why is pronunciation and intonation so important to language? Why aren't words themselves sufficient to convey meaning?
Well, you have to understand somebody else's words. I mean, if you go to central London and somebody's speaking Cockney and the words happen to match ours at some abstract level, you still may not understand them. The pronunciation may be different enough so that part of your knowledge of language is a way of decoding noises that you hear and converting them into a system that matches your own representations. Sometimes, now in order for that decoding system to work, the systems have to be close enough. You and I can do it. Actually, listen to us closely, we're speaking different languages. But they're close enough so that I don't have a problem decoding you and you don't have a problem decoding me. Another year, it can be 3 years or something like that. And people are playing with their languages often. Again, this is not too common in our societies. Our societies, remember, are basically technological societies. Our intelligence and creativity and so on goes into other things. But if you go to, say, Central Australia, where you're finding basically Stone Age tribes, there's a lot of innovation in language. A lot of the cultural wealth has to do with playing games with languages and constructing elaborate kinship systems and things which probably have no or little functional utility. It's just the creative mind at work. So you get very complex language games, a special language system taught as a puberty right, and only a particular group of people speak it, and nobody else understands it.
How does language differ in the way that it's used in the arts?
First of all, there's a variety of conventions, of formal conventions that are humanly created, but undoubtedly reflect our aesthetic capacities, that set a framework of rule, humanly imposed rule, within which people create. So, in an extreme case, if you write a sonnet, you have to come pretty close to a fixed frame. And while that's an extreme case, the same is true of other literary conventions. I mean, part of human creative intervention has been to create forms, aesthetic forms, which are somehow either appealing to us or challenge our intelligence or whatever. And you work within them. I mean, after all, painting on a piece of canvas that's that has a boundary, that's pretty recent in human history, and that itself imposes a framework which determines the kind of art that you can produce. And in the literary use of language is just everything from the structure of a novel to the metric character of a poetic form is one or another human invention.
Do you respond to poetry?
Do I? Sure. I've got time to read it.
Does it make you think differently? So what goes on in your thought process?
Well, I don't feel competent to say, but it's a topic that has been discussed quite intelligently, compressed, and you only get hints, so the reader has to impose a lot of structure.
You have to put your own self into it.
And in part because the formal structure itself imposes a challenge to the intelligence. If you're just throwing paint around randomly, it's not a work of art. But when it's done within the framework of a humanly constructed system of rule, at least you've got the prerequisites for a work of art. It still may not be. Whatever it takes, whatever creativity is, and that's not understood, that has to be there too. But certainly I have nothing to say about these topics. I wouldn't pretend to.
We bring up another area you can claim you have no expertise in, and that's the use of humor. We respond to people who use humor in communication, yet it's not taught in grade school. We're not taught how to be comedians, but we respond to it, and that seems to be the case in almost every language.
Well, see, I don't think that has too much to do with language. We can be humorous in other ways too. A clown can be humorous without using language, and nobody teaches a child how to laugh at a clown. Now, I think we're going here to interesting topics, but topics where nothing is understood. There's no doubt in my mind that there's something about human nature, the basic structure of the human mind, brain, which makes certain things comical and other things not. Just as there's certain things about the human brain that make some things come out to be a human language and others not, although they could be a Martian language or something. And at its root, it's, I don't think, fundamentally different from the fact that we grow arms and not wings. Now, we don't know why we grow arms and not wings, but you assume that it's got something to do with the human genetic endowment. And I think the comparable assumption is true in all these cases. Part of the fascination of the study of language is that it's one of the few examples where you can really get some insight into how it works. These other topics that you're mentioning, say humor, should be subjected to the same kind of study, but so far it hasn't been clear how to do it.
Words are endlessly fascinating, I think, because it's amazing how somebody can walk in a room, hear a few words,
and complex structure, which, at least at a scientific level, we understand very little about. But what you're pointing to is a central part of it. Little hints here and there succeed in evoking in us very rich experience and interpretation. And what's more, it's done surprisingly uniformly for different people, and it's of course done without any training or very minimal training. Nobody would know how to train people to do this. So it somehow must be the only logical possibility, aside from angels or acts of God, is it's something rooted in our nature. I mean, qualitatively speaking, these phenomena are very much like physical growth. The nutrition that's given to an organism, to an embryo, is not what determines that it's going to be a human or a bird. What determines that it's going to be a human or a bird is something about its internal structure. And what determines that we are going to be the kind of creature that can speak and that can interpret a sign or a line, a couple of lines or something as evoking an emotional experience or whatever, that's something in our nature, but it's so far beyond what we know how to study that you can only wave your hands at it at the moment.
How should parents react with respect to exposing their children to language? Should they expose them to all aspects of language, or should they simply let them develop any way they develop?
I suspect there's very little that parents can do to change the course of language development. I mean, we know from experience. Again, let me say, I'm not speaking about this from any expertise. I don't have any more expertise than personal experience. There's nothing in linguistic theory that gives answers to this question. But experience suffices to indicate, in no cases, that you can
create an environment in which a 5-year-old will sound like a college professor, and it's kind of comical, but they'll use big words and, complicated sentences and so on. I suspect you're probably harming the 5-year-old, but it's possible to do that. Children can be molded. On the other hand, if you just leave them alone, they're going to pick up the language of their culture. Typically, they'll pick up the language of their peers. Quite typically, there are exceptions, but typically children will learn the language they heard in the streets. So take me. My father spoke with a Ukrainian accent, and my mother spoke with a mixed New York Lithuanian accent, and I spoke urban Philadelphia, because that's what the kids were talking in the streets. And undoubtedly, if you really took my speech patterns and so on aside, you'd find influences from the parents and the uncles and so on, but overwhelmingly it's you pick up the pure culture. Why this happens, nobody knows, and how that. But there's something about humans, children, that gets them to grow the language that's roughly that of their peers, and it's a very rich system. It's an extremely rich system. They don't try. They can't prevent themselves from doing it. They can't make it happen. The parents can enrich anyone who has a 2-year-old knows that the kid is running around all over the place trying to find out what the name of everything is. And you can help them, and you can read the children and show them pictures, and they're all fascinated with it. They're periods of very rapid language growth where you just can't satiate the curiosity fast enough.
Amazingly so.
It's unbelievable, in fact. What actually happens is really astonishing. I mean, there have been, for example, at the peak periods of, forget the structure of language, which is is to try to define a word. So suppose you had an organism that wasn't equipped to learn the words of human language, and you really had to teach it those words by training. Well, you'd first have to define a word. What is the meaning of table, for instance? Nobody can do that.
You have to define the definition you're using to define the word.
But, you see, what we call definitions are not definitions. They're just hints. If you take the Oxford English Dictionary, the one you read with the magnifying glass, and they give you a long, detailed thing, which they call the definition of a word. In fact, it's very far from the definition of a word. It's a few hints that a person who already knows the concept can use to understand what's going on. But remember, the child is picking that up not from the Oxford English Dictionary with its whole array of hints. The child's picking it up from seeing it used once or twice. Now, that can only mean one thing. It can only mean that the concept itself, in all of its richness and complexity, is somehow sitting there, waiting to have a sound associated with it. Now, that can't be quite true, but something very much like that is probably true. That's why you and I will have essentially the same concept of table and the same concept of person and of, nation, or all sorts of things. They're not complicated things. I mean, really simple things like person, for instance, or thing. We'll have that even though we all have very limited experience, because basically we started with those concepts.
We're getting down to the end of the show. Do you ever see a time when the study of language and linguistics will not fascinate you?
Well, I suppose there must come some time when your mind deteriorates to the point where you can't deal with hard questions. I guess that'll happen.
Professor Noam Chomsky from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a guest lecturer at the University of Washington. Upon reflection.
International. Well, as we know at this point, there are quite a few theories as to who could be gaining from this situation. Let's now take a listen at what President Vladimir Putin had to say.
Plots are always possible, but they have an adverse impact on the conspirators, if there are any.
What is your take at this point as to who stands to gain from this situation? Who are these sides? Who are these people?
Well, this has been a report that's been out for several months. And then when you look at the IMF reports and others as well, demand is down. There's no question about it. The global economies are slowing down. But I'd like to read to you from this past Friday, October 17th, CNBC, the big business channel in the States and globally as well. And they're commenting, this is at 1:23 Eastern Time. One of the guests, I love it. The Kremlin had $117 budgeted for oil this year. And who is our enemy out there? and now it's at 81 a barrel. And what is the rhetoric coming out of Russia? It's the best thing, he's saying, for the U.S. Another guest, Saudi Arabia has Russia squarely in its sights, and it is extremely fashionable to try to hurt the Russian economy. But again, you look at, this is the rhetoric coming out. But then you have to look at the facts again. And when you look at the International Energy Agency, they have cut demand for 2015. And you're looking at the world markets. I mean, look at the decline we've seen, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Asia, whether it's in the United States. The fundamentals of the world economy are not sound, and demand is down.
Well, Gerald, what's interesting to analyze here is, apart from the fact that the demand is down, could there be other factors at play?
Yes, there can be, as these people are pointing out in the Business Channel. The Americans have been brainwashed into believing that Russia is our great enemy. And they're very delighted to see, for example, I just saw just before coming on, Russia's rating is cut by Moody's on sluggish economic growth. And some 45% of Russia's GDP depends on oil. So, and then you're looking at the sanctions as well. So there may be more behind it. But again, you also, I think, as Vladimir Putin made clear, there may be a plot, but it's hurting everyone. No one benefits from low oil prices. Not the Saudis. Certainly it's hurting Venezuela, Iran, the countries that, need production prices over $100 a barrel, as well as others. So this doesn't hurt Saudi Arabia either. It's not going to put anybody out of business. It's just going to drive down income, and everyone cannot afford to have lower income.
However, it is, still fascinating to look at possible, factors here at play, who stands to gain and who's losing and why. Just to pick up earlier on what you said about the U.S. and those who think that the U.S. is masterminding this whole thing. I mean, isn't the U.S. also losing from this, especially, the shale oil industry? Isn't it affected by this current crisis too?
Of course, everything is going to be affected by it. Having said all that, that doesn't mean that the so-called policymakers can continue to make stupid decisions. And they can be forcing prices down or putting pressure on Saudi Arabia and the other monarchies. For example, the Saudis announced over a month ago they were going to cut production, and then they backtracked on that. So, without the United States in the Middle East, in Bahrain, in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia, the United States is the protectorate of the monarchies. So who knows what kind of foreign policy initiatives are being made. And again, that's Russia squarely in its sights, and it is extremely fashionable to try to hurt the Russian economy. I have to tell you,
Dit zijn Jeff en Ellen. Beiden zijn zelfstandig ondernemer. En dus zijn beiden verplicht een boekhouding te voeren.
The Middle East, Iran going to nuclear, Russia on the move, China claiming territory that it doesn't really have a right to.
Reports by the day that show Russian troops are going further into southeastern Ukraine and helping turn the tide.
Can they be defeated without addressing that part of their organization which resides in Syria? The answer is no.
We're actively considering what's going to be necessary to deal with that threat, and we're not going to be restricted by borders.
Airstrikes. Bomb them. Bomb them. Keep bombing them. Bomb them again and again.
You don't have this basis if you were born yesterday. If you're born yesterday, you believe whatever anybody in authority tells you. You have no way of checking them on it. But we're little, they're histories might become dubious. A little history doesn't prove that the government is lying to you today. It just asks you to inquire if it is.
Contrary to popular belief, conduct of nations on the international stage is almost never driven by moral considerations, but rather by a shadowy cocktail of money and geopolitics. As such, when you see the mouthpieces of the ruling class begin to demonize a foreign country, the first question on your mind should always be, what is actually at stake here? For some time now, Russia, China, Iran, and Syria have been in the crosshairs. Once you understand why, the events unfolding in the world right now will make much more sense. The US dollar is a truly unique currency. In fact, its current design and its relationship to geopolitics is unlike any other in history. Though it has been the world reserve currency since 1945, this is not what makes it unique. Many currencies have held their reserve status off and on over the centuries. But what makes the dollar unique is the fact that it's held $14 billion in US dollars. However, the United States only had $3.2 billion in gold allocated to cover foreign holdings. Translation: the Federal Reserve was printing more money than it could actually back. The result was rampant inflation and a general flight from the dollar. In 1971, in what later came to be called the Nixon shock, President Nixon removed the dollar from the gold standard completely.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
At this point, the dollar became a pure debt-based currency. With debt-based currencies, money is literally loaned into existence. Approximately 70% of the money in circulation is created by ordinary banks, which are allowed to loan out more money than they actually have in their accounts. The rest is created by the Federal Reserve, which loans out money that they don't have, mostly the government. It's kind of like writing hot checks, except it's legal for banks. This practice, which is referred to as fractional reserve banking, is supposedly regulated by the Federal Reserve, an institution which just happens to be owned and controlled by a conglomerate of banks. And no agency or branch of government regulates the Federal Reserve.
What is the proper relationship, what should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government, and there is no evidence that the administration or the Congress or anybody else is requesting that we do things other than what we think is the appropriate thing. Then what the relationships are don't frankly matter.
Now, to make things even more interesting, these fractional reserve loans have interest attached, but the money to pay that interest doesn't exist in the system. As a result, there's always more total debt than there is money in circulation. And in order to stay afloat, the economy must grow perpetually. This is obviously not sustainable. Now, you might be wondering how the dollar has maintained such a dominant position on the world stage for over 40 years. It's really little more than an elaborate to establish what later came to be referred to as the petrodollar recycling system. Under the arrangement, Saudis would only sell their oil in US dollars and would invest the majority of their excess profits into US banks and capital markets. The IMF would then use this money to facilitate loans to oil importers who were having difficulties covering the increase in oil prices. The interest and payments on these loans would of course be denominated in US dollars. This agreement was formalized in the U.S.-Saudi Arabian Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation, put together by Nixon's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, in 1974. The system was expanded to include the rest of OPEC by 1975. Though presented as a buffer to the recessionary effects of rising oil prices, this arrangement had a hidden side effect. It removed the traditional restraints on U.S. monetary policy. The Federal Reserve was now free to increase the money supply at will. The ever-increasing demand for oil would prevent a flight from the dollar, while distributing the inflationary consequences across the entire planet. The dollar went from being a gold-backed currency to an oil-backed currency. It also became America's primary export. Did you ever wonder how the U.S. economy has been able to stay afloat while running multi-billion-dollar trade deficits for decades? Do you ever wonder how it is that the U.S. holds such a disproportionate amount of the world's wealth, when 70% of the U.S. economy is consumer-based? In the modern era, fossil fuels make the world go round. They have become integrated into every aspect of civilization. Agriculture, transportation, plastics, heating, defense, medicine, and demand just keeps growing. As long as the world needs oil, and as long as oil is only sold in U.S. dollars, there will be a demand for U.S. dollars. And that demand is what gives the dollar its value. For the United States, this is a great deal. Dollars go out, either as paper or digits in a computer system, and real, tangible products and services come in. However, for the rest of the world, a very sneaky form of exploitation. Having global trade predominantly in dollars also provides Washington with a powerful financial weapon through sanctions. This is due to the fact that most large-scale dollar transactions are forced to pass through the U.S. This petrodollar system stood unchallenged until September of 2000, when Saddam Hussein announced his decision to switch Iraq's oil sales off of the dollar to euros. This was a direct attack on the dollar, and easily the most important geopolitical event of the year. But only one article in the Western media even mentioned it. In the same month that Saddam announced he was moving away from the dollar, an organization called the Project for a New American Century, of which Dick Cheney just happened to be a member, released a document entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategy, Forces, and Resources for a New Century. This document called for massive increases in U.S. military spending and a much more aggressive foreign policy in order to expand U.S. dominance worldwide. However, the document lamented that achieving these goals would take many years, quote, absent some catastrophic catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor, end quote. 1 year later, they got it. Riding the emotional reaction to 9/11, the Bush administration was able to invade Afghanistan, Iraq, pass the Patriot Act, all without any significant resistance.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you gotta come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision we're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we own governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
There were no weapons of mass destruction.
Or UN forces should have moved into Baghdad? No. Why not?
Because if we'd gone to Baghdad, we would have been, or the Syrians would like to have the west, part of eastern Iraq. The Iranians would like to claim, fought over for 8 years. In the north, you've got the Kurds. And if the Kurds spin loose and join with the Kurds in Turkey, then you threaten the territorial integrity of Turkey. It's a quagmire if you go that far and try to take it down.
They knew exactly what was going to happen. But in 2003, they did it anyway. Once Iraqi oil fields were under U.S. control, oil sales were immediately switched back to the dollar. This is obviously not sustainable. Now you might be wondering how the dollar has maintained such a dominant position on the world stage for over 40 years, if it's really little more than an elaborate to establish what later came to be referred to as the petrodollar recycling system. Under the arrangement, Saudis would only sell their oil in U.S. dollars and would invest the majority of their excess profits into U.S. banks and capital markets. The IMF would then use this money to facilitate loans to oil importers who were having difficulties covering the increase in oil prices. The interest and payments on these loans would of course be denominated in U.S. dollars. This agreement was formalized in the U.S.-Saudi Arabian Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation, put together by Nixon's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, in 1974. The system was expanded to include the rest of OPEC by 1975. Though presented as a buffer to the recessionary effects of rising oil prices, this arrangement had a hidden side effect. It removed the traditional restraints on U.S. monetary policy. The The Federal Reserve was now free to increase the money supply at will. The ever-increasing demand for oil would prevent the flight from the dollar, while distributing the inflationary consequences across the entire planet. The dollar went from being a gold-backed currency to an oil-backed currency. It also became America's primary export. Did you ever wonder how the U.S. economy has been able to stay afloat while running multi-billion-dollar trade deficits for decades? Did you ever wonder how it is that the U.S. holds such a disproportionate amount of the world's wealth when 70% of the U.S. economy is consumer-based? In the modern era, fossil fuels make the world go round. They have become integrated into every aspect of civilization. Agriculture, transportation, plastics, heating, defense, medicine, and demand just keeps growing. As long as the world needs oil, and as long as oil is only sold in US dollars, there will be a demand for US dollars. And that demand is what gives the dollar its value. For the United States, this is a great deal. Dollars go out, either as paper or digits in a computer system, and real, tangible products and services come in. However, for the rest of the world, a very sneaky form of exploitation. Having global trade predominantly in dollars also provides Washington with a powerful financial weapon through sanctions. This is due to the fact that most large-scale dollar transactions are forced to pass through the U.S. This petrodollar system stood unchallenged until September of 2000, when Saddam Hussein announced his decision to switch Iraq's oil sales off of the dollar to euros. This was a direct attack on the dollar, and easily the most important geopolitical event of the year. But only one article in the Western media even mentioned it. In the same month that Saddam announced he was moving away from the dollar, an organization called the Project for a New American Century, of which Dick Cheney just happened to be a member, released a document entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategy, Forces, and Resources for a New Century. This document called for massive increases in U.S. military spending and a much more aggressive foreign policy in order to expand U.S. dominance worldwide. However, the document lamented that achieving these goals would take many years, quote, absent some catastrophic catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor, end quote. 1 year later, they got it. Riding the emotional reaction to 9/11, the Bush administration was able to invade Afghanistan, Iraq, pass the Patriot Act, all without any significant resistance.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you gotta come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about. He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we run governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
There were no weapons of mass destruction.
Or UN forces should have moved into Baghdad?
No.
Why not?
Because if we'd gone to Baghdad, we would have been all alone. There wouldn't have been anybody else with us. It would have been a U.S. occupation of Iraq. None of the Arab forces that were willing to fight with us in Kuwait were willing to invade Iraq. Once you got to Iraq and took it over and took down Saddam Hussein's government, then what are you going to put in its place? That's a very volatile part of the world, and if you take down the central government in Iraq, you can easily end up seeing pieces of Iraq fly off. Part of it, the Syrians would like to have to the west. Part of eastern Iraq, the Iranians would like to claim fought over for 8 years. In the north, you've got the Kurds. And if the Kurds spin loose and join with the Kurds in Turkey, then you threaten the territorial integrity of Turkey. It's a quagmire. You go that far and try to take it down.
They knew exactly what was going to happen. But in 2003, they did it anyway. Once Iraqi oil fields were under U.S. control, oil sales were immediately switched back to the dollar. Mission accomplished. Soon after the invasion of Iraq, the Bush administration attempted to extend these wars to Iran. Supposedly, the Iranian government was working to build a nuclear weapon. After the Iraq fiasco, Washington's credibility was severely damaged. As a result, they were unable to muster international or domestic support for an intervention. Their efforts were further sabotaged by elements within the CIA and Mossad, who came forward to state that Iran had not even made the decision to develop nuclear weapons, much less begin an attempt. However, the demonization campaign against Iran continued, even into the Obama administration. Why? In 2004, Iran has been in the process of organizing an independent oil bourse. The Iranians were building their own unified state with a single currency. It was the nature of that proposed currency that got him killed. In March of 2009, the African Union released a document entitled Towards a Single African Currency. Pages 106 and 107 of that document specifically discuss the benefits and technicalities of running the African Central Bank under a gold standard. On page 94, it explicitly states that the key to the success of the African Monetary Union would be the, quote, eventual linking of a single African currency to the most monetary of all commodities, gold. In 2011, the CIA moved into Libya and began backing militant groups in their campaign to topple Gaddafi. And the US and NATO pushed through and stretched a UN no-fly zone resolution to tip the balance with airstrikes. The presence of al-Qaeda extremists among these rebel fighters was swept under the rug. Libya, like Iran and Iraq, had committed the unforgivable crime of challenging the US dollar. The NATO intervention in Libya segued into a covert war on Syria. The armories of the Libyan government would lose this as a necessary evil. In fact, the Council on Foreign Relations published UN and Russian investigators, and the push for airstrikes completely fell apart when Russia stepped in to broker a diplomatic solution. The campaign for regime change in Syria, as in Libya, has been presented in terms of human rights. Obviously, this isn't the real motive. In 2009, Qatar put forth a proposal to run a natural gas pipeline through Syria and Turkey to Europe. Assad, however, rejected this. And in 2011, he forged a pact with Iraq and Iran to build a pipeline eastward, cutting Qatar and Saudi Arabia out of the loop. Obviously reduces the U.S. government's leverage. 2. Ukraine. The real target, however, is Russia. You see, Russia just happens to be the world's second largest oil exporter. And not only have they been a thorn in Washington's side diplomatically, but they also opened up an energy bourse in 2008 with sales denominated in rubles and gold. Russia has also been in the process of organizing a Eurasian Economic Union, which includes plans to adopt a common currency unit and which is slated to have its own independent energy market. Leading up to the crisis, Ukraine had been presented with a choice: either join the EU under an association agreement or join the Eurasian Union. The EU insisted that this was an either-or proposition. Ukraine couldn't join both. Russia, on the other hand, asserted that joining both posed no issue with the situation. Crimea held a referendum, and the people voted overwhelmingly to secede from Ukraine and reunify with Russia. The transition was orderly and peaceful. No one was killed. Yet the West immediately framed the entire event as an act of Russian aggression. And this became the go-to mantra from that point on. Crimea is important geostrategically because of its position in the Black Sea, which allows for the projection of naval power into the Mediterranean. Now, the U.S. has been pushing for Ukraine's inclusion into NATO for years now. Such a move would place U.S. forces right on Russia's border, and could have potentially resulted in Russia losing their naval base in Crimea. This is why Russia immediately accepted the results of the Crimean referendum and quickly consolidated the territory. Meanwhile, in eastern Ukraine, 2 regions declared independence from Kiev and held referendums of their own, the results of which overwhelmingly favored self-rule. Kiev responded to this with what they referred to as anti-terrorist operations. In practice, this was a massive and indiscriminate shelling campaign which killed thousands of civilians. Apparently, killing civilians didn't qualify as aggression to the West. In fact, the IMF explicitly warned the provisional government that their $17 billion loan package could be in danger if they were not able to put down the uprising in eastern Ukraine. While the war was elected the Cold War 2.0, this is World War 3.0. The masses may not have figured it out yet, but history will remember it that way. Alliances are solidifying and hot wars are underway on multiple fronts. If the provocations and proxy wars continue, it's only a matter of time before the big players confront each other directly, and that is a recipe for disaster. Does all of this sound insane to you? Oh, you're right. The people running the world right now are insane, and the public is sleepwalking into a tragedy. If you want to alter the course that we are on, there's only one way to do it. We have to wake up that public. Even the most powerful weapons of war are neutralized if you reach the mind of the man behind the trigger. How do we wake the masses, you ask? Don't wait for someone else to answer that for you. Get creative. Act like your children's and grandchildren's futures depend on it, because they do. If this message resonates with you, then spread it. If you want to see the big picture, trust me, we've got some very interesting reports coming. Subscribe to Storm Clouds Gathering on YouTube and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Google+. Also be sure to go to our website, scgnews.com, and sign up for email updates.
Virgil, die dus gewoon een overwinning pakt in de legendarische Boston Garden.
Dit is Junkyard Dog. 1, 2, 3, let's see.
En dan natuurlijk Virgil of Bodyguard. Later zou hij ook in de ring stappen en misschien wel een title winnen, maar de echte bodyguard der bodyguards, daar staat hij, Big Daddy Cool Diesel. Hij debuteerde als de bodyguard van Shawn Michaels, maar zou uiteindelijk ook zelf in de ring stappen. Welcome everybody! Ja, WWE Live. En voor de fans in Nederland en België goed nieuws. Vrijdag 17 april. Komen onder andere John Cena, Dolph Ziggler, Ryback en nog veel meer WWE.
Where that comes on a pretty extensive background checks, right? So federal background checks, multi-state database, as well as county checks. I mean, far superior to anything that sort of taxi systems are doing in the country. So we just make sure that the foundation is in place so that customers get the safest ride possible. And then, of course, if something goes wrong, we're going to do everything we can, everything in our ability to make sure that the rider is taken care of.
In part, Richard, part of what we're seeing here is they say they have extensive background checks here in the United States, but if we look, the accused driver was reportedly a convicted sex offender, and he had a government-issued license. So they didn't do the background check there. They thought this was already taken care of. So it's not really a one-size-fits-all when it comes to expanding into international markets. This is something they're going to have to look at as they expand.
Lois Eagle keeping the studio warm in New York. Well, apparently it's going to be quite cold and chilly over the next few days, so doing a stunning work. Thank you, Lloyd. When we come back, Sony's woes continue. There's a second cyber attack in less than a week. We're going to look at why hackers keep breaking into the house of Sony, and we're also going to consider the startup nation where tech seems to be king and the rules of the game here. Quest Means Business in Jerusalem tonight.
In association with Access Bank.
All the security guards, the bodyguards. En dit is wel de grandest van allemaal. Diesel. En op 30 april 1994 kwam hij dus uit tegen Razor Ramon.
Diesel, pure kracht. Ook natuurlijk zijn lengte, een metertje of 2. Tegen Razor Ramon, de bad guy. Die ook wel van zijn kracht en zijn lengte moest hebben. En techniek. Maar Diesel, ja, wat zou de man zijn waar WWE op gebouwd werd eigenlijk. Hij zou de leider zijn van de New Generation. Tja, nu dus een kans om de Intercontinental title te winnen van Razor Ramon.
En dat heeft hij wel echt gedaan ook.
En Razor, dit was natuurlijk vlak na die ladder match van WrestleMania 10 tussen Razor en Shawn Michaels. Dus daar moet hij nog last van hebben. Dat kan niet anders.
Ja, en Diesel natuurlijk topfit. Weinig matches onder zijn belt.
De Bulldog van de bad guy, lateral press en de 2 count.
Aan de andere kant had Razor Ramon natuurlijk ontzettend veel en uithoudingsvermogen.
En natuurlijk de titel is er bezit, dus Diesel moest de
winnen via pinfall of submission. Moet die match op die manier winnen.
De interference van Michaels wordt keihard afgestraft hier door Ramon. Maar Ramon gaat in de voet van Diesel. En dat is een biggie.
Diesel inderdaad minder ervaring dan Ramon, zoals je al zei. Maar kracht maakt natuurlijk heel veel goed. Hoewel, daar gaat Michaels weer. Vliegt ook alle kanten op, hè. Ook al staat hij buiten de ring, dan is de spotlight nog op Shawn Michaels gericht.
Ja, bizar. Razor Ramon in de turnbuckle, daar in de boot van Diesel. Diesel in position.
Jackknife powerbomb. En de nieuwe Intercontinental Champion, Big Daddy Cool. Diesel power.
Uiteindelijk zou hij het op eigen kracht gaan doen. En wat kwam die man ver. Misschien niet zo ver als deze man.
Maar hij wordt nog flink in de buurt.
Zeker.
Shawn Michaels en Diesel, wat?
Dat weet je niet.
Dat weet ik.
The two events?
Richard, it doesn't appear that there is any connection at this point, but imagine coming home last week finding out that your house was burgled, and this week finding out that there's graffiti on the house of Sony. In this case, this time it was a Sony PlayStation, as you mentioned. It doesn't look like the intruders got into the house this time. They say the intruders weren't able to access the network, that's according to Sony, and more importantly, the intruders weren't able to go into the drawers inside the house and get personal information from the PlayStation game console that was offline for just a few hours. Nothing compared to the hack last week, Richard, where intruders got into the house. We already know that there were leaks, not leaky faucets, but leaks of films, the social security numbers of employees, the passports of employees, Richard. And now people are still investigating whether it was North Korea who put up their flag in front of the house of Sony. Recode, a well-respected media tech blog in Silicon Valley, reported that last week. But Richard, so far, Sony has not come out and said that publicly as they continue their investigation into who's been getting into the house of Sony.
Look, why Sony? I mean, all right, so they've got lots of movies, and they were able to release the details of employees' social security numbers and salaries of stars. But is there a reason, is there a theory as to why Sony, or was that just the weakest link?
It looks like it may just be the weakest link. To answer your question, it's two separate answers. On the one hand, North Korea was upset about that film, the interview, the comedy about assassinating Kim Jong-un. On the other hand, this group that maybe graffitied the house of Sony, Richard, Lizard Squad, you mentioned, we don't know who they are, but it doesn't look like they have any ties to North Korea, at least not on the surface. And they have a website that's based in Russia. Do we know they're Russian? No, but we know that this website is based in Russia, so it looks like a bad string of luck for the house of Sony.
Samuel back in New York. Bad luck for you, Samuel. Don't touch the bell. You can't. I brought it with me. Here in Israel, cyber security is taken particularly seriously. Earlier this year, the Israeli government set up a national cyber defense authority to protect the civilian network. Protection is crucial for the country's flourishing tech scene. Joining me now is Moshe Hoek, the founder and CEO of Probably Media. Good to see you, sir.
Very nice to
So, the hacking, the cyber hacking, the rest of the world suffers. But in Israel, of course, you had to make it an industry to be against the cyber, which you've done quite well.
Yeah, you know, I think the main reason is that Israel is not busy with the security of your email address, with no offense to the privacy of email addresses and phone numbers. It's more about the nation-level security with what terrorist organizations can do.
But the government has certainly spotted an opportunity to carve out a thriving industry in cybersecurity here.
100%. And again, the main reason we need to remember is that the Internet of Things becoming close and close, and the ability to affect the Razor Ramon in the turnbuckle, there in the boot from Diesel. Diesel in position.
Jackknife powerbomb. And the nieuwe Intercontinental Champion, Big Daddy Cool. Diesel power.
zou ik hem aankracht gaan doen. En was nog niemand ver. Misschien niet zo ver als deze man.
Maar toch flink in de buurt. Shawn Michaels en Diesel, wat?
Dat weet je niet.
Dat weet ik.
The two events.
Richard, it doesn't appear that there is any connection at this point, but imagine coming home last week finding out that your house was burgled, and this week finding out that there's graffiti on the house of Sony. In this case, this time it was put a Sony PlayStation, as you mentioned. It doesn't look like the intruders got into the house this time. They say the intruders weren't able to access the network, that's according to Sony, and more importantly, the intruders weren't able to go into the drawers inside the house and get personal information from the PlayStation game console that was offline for just a few hours. Nothing compared to the hack last week, Richard, where intruders got into the house. We already know that there were leaks, not leaky faucets, but leaks of films, the social security numbers of employees, the passports of employees, Richard. And now people are still investigating whether it was North Korea who put up their flag in front of the house of Sony. Recode, a well-respected media tech blog in Silicon Valley, reported that last week. But Richard, so far, Sony has not come out and said that publicly as they continue their investigation into who's been getting into the house of Sony.
Look, why Sony? I mean, all right, so they've got lots of movies, and they were able to release the details of employees' social security numbers and salaries of stars. But is there a reason, is there a theory as to why Sony, or was that just the weakest link?
It looks like it may just be the weakest link. To answer your question, it's two separate answers. On the one hand, North Korea was upset about that film, the interview, the comedy about assassinating Kim Jong-un. On the other hand, this group that maybe graffitied the house of Sony, Richard, Lizard Squad, you mentioned, we don't know who they are, but it doesn't look like they have any ties to North Korea, at least not on the surface. And they have a website that's based in Russia. Do we know they're Russian? No, but we know that this website is based in Russia, so it looks like a bad string of luck for the house of Sony.
Samuel Berg in New York. Bad luck for you, Samuel. Don't touch the bell. You can't. I brought it with me. Here in Israel, cyber security is taken particularly seriously. Earlier this year, the Israeli government set up a national cyber defense authority to protect the civilian network. Protection is crucial for the country's flourishing tech scene. Joining me now is Moshe Hoek, the founder and CEO of Republic Media. Good to see you, sir. Hey, nice to meet you. So, the hacking, the cyber hacking, the rest of the world suffers. But in Israel, of course, you had to make it an industry to be against the cyber, which is doing quite well.
Yeah, you know, I think the main reason is that Israel is not busy with the security of his email address, with no offense to the privacy of email addresses and phone numbers. It's more about the nation-level security with what terrorist organizations can do.
But the government has certainly spotted an opportunity to carve out a thriving industry in cybersecurity here.
100%. And again, the main reason we need to remember is that the Internet of Things becoming close and close, and the ability to affect the physical world by affecting the virtual world is becoming closer and closer. So for Israel, it's a real threat, and we need to address it.
And in doing that, you've created an entire industry.
100%, yes, we did. You know, I think that the south of Israel, Beersheba, is becoming the cyber security capital of Israel, and a lot of companies are busy with that.
You travel extensively with Moby. You see different environments. I've read Startup Nation. I'm sick and tired of hearing that phrase, as I'm sure you are, the Startup Nation. But what is it that makes this country so conducive, so available for entrepreneurs like you?
You know, I think it's the circumstances. We don't have oil. Think about it. We don't have oil. We don't have any natural resource. The only resource we have is the human brain, which is probably the most powerful resource, and we don't have a choice.
You all have to keep ahead of each other.
100%, yes, we do.
We come back. The new European Union trade chief says it's time to speed up transatlantic trade talks. She's talking about a fresh start. a fresh start with trade, an exclusive...
Shannon, ga zitten. Dat kan ik niet. Dit... New modern legislation in the... We zijn nu aan het buurten op de... The first time.
Nieuw aan iemand brengen van A naar B.
This is not a screen. This is a window. Or two.
Dat kan je niet zonder iets.
And it's seeing in the dark.
We'll grab the grader and...
The Opera House, the glistening harbour. Sydney will host the AFC Asian Cup final in 2015 as some of the world's greatest international sporting competitions take place right across Australia. Football kicks things off with the Asian Cup being held down under for the first time, and the Socceroos are chasing glory on home soil. The tournament has been dominated by Japan and Saudi Arabia since 1984.
Even, maar ik...
Tegen deze vorm van kinderkanker.
Dat alle kinderen onze kinderen zijn. Steun de mama's.
I'm Paula Hancock in Seoul, and this is CNN.
Quest in Jerusalem tonight. There's more Quest Means Business in just a moment. This is CNN. And on this network, the news always comes first. Israel's Knesset parliament has cleared the way for early elections. A short time ago, lawmakers voted to dissolve parliament and hold elections in 99 days. It follows months of turmoil inside a deeply divided government. The Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is looking for a mandate after firing two...
I'm Paula Hancock in Seoul, and this is CNN.
Hello, I'm Richard Quest in Jerusalem tonight. There's more Quest Means Business in just a moment. This is CNN. And on this network, the news always comes first. Israel's Knesset parliament has cleared the way for early elections. A short time ago, lawmakers voted to dissolve parliament and hold elections in 99 days. It follows months of turmoil inside a deeply divided government. The Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is looking for a mandate after firing two senior ministers. Syria and Iran are condemning a suspected Israeli airstrike near Damascus. They call it an act of aggression. Syria's military said there were attacks in two places, one of them at a civil airport. No casualties were reported. Israeli officials, as is customary, have not responded to the accusations. A British man accused of plotting to have his bride murdered during their honeymoon in South Africa has walked free from court. The judge threw out the case against Shri and Dewani, saying the prosecution failed to produce any convincing evidence. US Marines around the world are on alert. This is a precaution ahead of the release of a report on enhanced interrogation techniques and tactics. A heightened alert means Marines will be ready to deploy faster in case a crisis erupts. And the US Supreme Court has rejected BP's challenge over the amount it should pay for the Gulf of Mexico oil spill. BP argued some businesses were getting compensation payouts even though their losses did not stem from the spill. The company has said it could end up paying $10 billion or more in claims. to rebut some myths and misconceptions. Well, that's the goal and the dream of the new EU Trade Commissioner, Cecilia Malmström, who's just taken office. The Commissioner told me it's a big part of the current round of transatlantic trade talks, myths and misconceptions. And so she's leading the European